Hi, and welcome to The Fault Line, a CMG consulting podcast exploring the pivotal moments where business strategy meets real-world pressure. Today's topic is one that I have passion for, and I'm positive my partner in crime, Kim, does as well. We're going to talk about lean and efficient versus resilient in terms of organizations. And I come at this with some personal experience and also through a lot of observation. There are a number of different ways that organizations have gotten more efficient over time. And I think it's a very commendable pursuit. Over the last 20 years, we've seen a significant drop in the proportion of large and mid-cap companies that are publicly traded. Private equity has had a significant impact, and not just on the companies that private equity owns and operates, but also on their competition, right? Even publicly traded companies today continue to pursue efficiencies wherever and whenever they can. And shareholders appreciate it. It drives money right to the bottom line. It makes the income statement look better. It makes the balance sheet look better. And all we want to sort of dive into today, though, is at what cost or with what side effects. Because as a friend of mine who works for a large consumer packaged goods company said, he feels their organization is so lean that it might be brittle. And that's a provocative statement, and there's a lot of detail behind that. So without further ado, I'm going to pitch it over to Kim and ask her for a little kickoff perspective on this topic.
Thanks, Gary. So I'm going to reflect back to 12, 13 years ago in my career. I had a boss who asked us to pick a quote that represented how we thought about work and put it up on our cubicle wall. Mine was root out and reject inefficiency. And so it's right in line with our topic today. And I think what we're here to talk about is how you cannot sacrifice innovation for efficiency. There has to be the right balance in those things in order for organizations to really thrive, to have the growth that they're looking for, and for people to be excited about work.
Yeah, I would agree with that. For me, it's a little bit broader than innovation as well. There's a fundamental element of resiliency. Resiliency in the face of the unexpected, and that could be an unexpected competitive move. It could be the unexpected departure of a key individual. It could be the unexpected sort of drying up of the appeal of your organization's value proposition, as markets mature. And there's a lot of different ways of coming at this. I'm curious, is there an example that just leaps to mind where you've worked with an organization, Kim, that had gotten so focused on being efficient that it actually created risk for itself?
I mean, I think anytime, I don't know that I have a specific example, but let's talk this one out. Anytime you are so focused on your operating income, but you're not thinking about if you're generating the right products for the future, if you're not thinking about how you sustain growth that maybe you're experiencing in current times, you're creating risk, right? Because you're not doing that. What we've talked about on previous episodes, you're not looking out and ahead. And I think resilience is when you are looking out and ahead, you build that resilience in. So in former roles where I had a QA team reporting to me and I had software development kind of as part of my structure, we built quality in. You have to build resilience in. And I think that is the way to not get caught off guard, if you will. So it's like if you put your head in the sand as a leader and you're like, we're doing great things, let's just keep moving forward, but you've got your head in the sand and you're not examining the market on a regular basis, you won't have that resilience and you might be super efficient at doing something that's not good.
Yeah. There's also, I think related to that, and this does come back to innovation, is at times there's a misalignment between the time frame within which leadership wants to generate value and how long it takes to actually create the new wave of value from innovation, right? So, this applies to companies that bend and pour metal, right? Automotive companies, engine companies, folks like that. Oftentimes it might take years to bring a new platform to market. And under certain circumstances, ownership might say, well, if it takes us 5 years to do that, that's beyond our window. We're looking to sell this turnaround business in the next 3. And so you get this sort of friction. This is truly a fault line, right? Where somebody says, your strategy is valid. I see it, and we're not going to invest in it because it's outside our window. For us, that just creates more cost, but we don't see the benefits of it. And in the singular instance, that might make sense, but perpetuated over time, what it can really do is undermine the viability of that organization for the long haul. Similarly, I think private equity does really good things in many organizations when they first take over. They'll come in, they'll focus on the income statement, they'll focus on the balance sheet, they'll improve cash flow, they'll sell off excess inventory. All of those things are making the financials look that much better and creating, perceived value and actual value for the organization. I've also seen, headcount reductions distill an organization down to a single individual who might be capable in a certain area. And there's no bench strength at that point. There's no accommodation. If somebody in that position then leaves, it's like losing a unicorn, right? There's nobody else who can substitute in for them. And in one instance with which I'm familiar, it turned out that a part of the legal team that was focused on trade and import-export and compliance with various federal and other, national regulations had been distilled down to one person being accountable for it, and that individual left the organization. And it wasn't a watershed moment. What ended up happening is that individual left at the same time that there was a hiring freeze. And so small moments of non-compliance started to stack up. And about 18 months later, that organization ended up discovering the challenge and having to sort of come clean and pay significant fines because they had drifted out of compliance. There was simply no backfill for that person. And, that to me is one of those instances where getting lean created risk. And then the risk turned into a lack of resilience that became quite costly. And, I'm wondering, as you coach leaders, as you engage with the folks who are providing the direction for organizations, how might you come at some of these topics to help them be better in balancing some of those considerations?
Yeah, I'm smirking. For those of you who are only listening to us, I'm smirking because often when I tell people I'm a transformation consultant, the first thing they ask is, so you fly around the country and you fire people? And that's definitely not what I do, because to Gary's point, right, that is not the best way to build resiliency in an organization. You
Correct.
have to understand where your pinch points are from a capabilities perspective, so that you have the bench strength that you're talking about. So when I'm guiding, back to your question, post smirk question, which is, how would I coach a leader? It is to think about the value that each individual is contributing to your organization and the capabilities that they have. So when we're looking at just the people side, so if we break it down to kind of people, process, technology, it's kind of traditional way a transformation consultant might look at things. From the people perspective, it's where are folks adding value? Where are we adding people to do things that's not adding value? So we're creating waste, which is another way that we're decreasing our resiliency, because we're building things that we won't maintain in the future, whether that's software development, process, or anything. When we think about process for process sake is not resiliency. It's more on that efficiency side of the equation without understanding why we're building the efficiency. So I fall back typically when I'm coaching leaders onto my business analysis kind of mindset, which is asking usually 5 whys, or using a 5 whys technique into why are we doing this thing, or like, why are we still doing this thing, right? We have product organizations that have products that are not resilient because we're ignoring them, and that could damage our brand. If we're not constantly asking those questions as a leadership team and we're just ignoring, that's where we get in trouble.
Yeah. I like the judo move that you pulled in the middle of that comment, which was to say resiliency and efficiency are not necessarily on opposite sides of the spectrum. And to think about the organization, and these are my words, from a fairly holistic standpoint, to understand where we have opportunities to be more efficient without creating risk, and where we may want to add a bit of resource to increase resilience. Um, again, going back to my friend who talked about his organization feeling brittle. In his case, they've flattened the organization, removed some layers in management. So his span of control is pretty wide at this point. And, the inference that he made, which I thought was provocative and pretty insightful, was they've now built an incentive for the people who are earlier in their careers to leave the organization because there's no place for them to naturally go next. He said, on my team, I might have one person who could backfill my role at this point, but for the other 13, they're not prepared to succeed if they ascend to this position. And they see it. So then when they're thinking about, well, what's next for me career-wise, they look at opportunities that will get them the additional experience and capabilities that they might need to come back as a director or a vice president. But there are a lot of years between somebody who's 3 years out of business school and that director position. And so attrition has become a much bigger issue for them. I think that's another version of this efficiency. Hey, you know what? We got wider spans of control. We don't have as many bodies to generate the value that we do as an organization. And again, the side effect is it comes at some cost.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is there has to be succession planning.
Yeah. And some way to reward people if they need to take lateral moves to build skills rather than the old, consumer package goods.
Right.
I'm an assistant brand manager. I'm an associate brand manager. I'm a brand manager. I'm a senior brand manager. And I know exactly what that time frame is, right? That's not the reality that we live in most organizations today.
So, resiliency comes in lots of different flavors, and you can build resiliency, I think, at a team level, right? So more that kind of the team is super resilient, but the organization they're in is not. So curious from your perspective, like how those two things work together to create the magic.
Well, it's funny because this leans right back into, and by the way, every time I say lean, I make Kim smirk. But this does sort of lead us right back into a theme that I come back to over and over and over again. The power of high trust cross-functional groups that are clear on what they're trying to achieve. Because a certain amount of resiliency is in the moments of betrayal or shock or failure to then solve a problem, right? And very rarely does that come down to one individual knows how to do it. So, I do think that even in a very lean organization, when the various functions are not sitting in their silos and wondering what's going on in the other functions, but they're actually collaborating because they're aligned on what they're trying to achieve and they trust one another. Then when something literally blows up or somebody leaves the organization, there's an ability for the other members of the team to compensate, at least for some period of time. And that kind of resiliency is immensely valuable in a variety of different ways. It helps with, retention because, hey, it feels good to be in a high trust team. It helps with achievement because high trust teams tend to collaborate and problem solve better than ones that don't trust one another. And competitively, they tend to deliver better results over time. And, I think within a culture that may be less oriented towards that, the role modeling of a solid cross-functional team can actually start to generate its own momentum, its own gravitational pull, and sort of display behaviors that others will choose to adopt because they see the effectiveness of it. And, that is its own theme. Maybe it's another podcast theme at some point, but it's likening, steering the ship from the engine room. If you get a group of people stoking enough coal in one engine, the ship will turn. And And what you want to have happen is that to be happening in a positive way, so that the people who are up on the bridge with the fancy uniforms and their hands on the wheel go, oh, we can feel the ship is turning. I feel like this is a good thing. Maybe we should do more of this, not fight against it.
Yeah. So going back to the question you asked me before about coaching leaders and what you were just saying, which is providing clarity is for the rest of the team is probably one of the most important things that leaders can do in order to build resiliency. Because as they build clarity, people become more and more focused on the right things to do, which is where resiliency gets built in. So you're making me think about an organization I've worked with over the past 2 years where um, the leaders they weren't providing that clarity. They weren't necessarily creating an environment where healthy debate and shared ownership was valued. And so we had to coach those leaders to um, get more confident,
Yeah.
essentially, in
Yeah.
their ability to delegate, in their ability to change how decisions were made, to let others make decisions, and to bring clear prioritization criteria to the organization, so that regardless of who was doing work at the individual contributor level, they had clarity, which made them do the right things. Efficiency was already being successful inside this organization, so they didn't have to worry about efficiency, but they were able to redirect that efficient energy to the most important things because they had clarity on the priorities. And so that would be top 3 thing that I would coach a leader on.
And I love that. It jives right in line with this idea of strategic clarity enables teams to make the choices about what it should be prioritized and also what should be ignored or put aside,
Mhm.
right? A lot of people think about priority as the must do's, and there is a place for that. There is as much benefit in the, well, that's interesting, but not on strategy moment to say, yeah, oh, yeah, it's interesting, but that's not the direction we're going, and to put it aside and not get distracted. Because in a highly efficient organization, there isn't a lot of slack, right? We've talked about that, how it may create brittleness. So then the ability to sort of stay on task and not get distracted, everybody's running at 100% in a lean environment, right? Highly efficient organizations tend not to have a lot of excess capacity sitting around. So every incremental ask feels like staying after school or extra effort. And that clarity says, well, these are the boundaries. This is how we're going to, move forward. This is, something. And if an idea, a concept, a potential opportunity comes up, the ability to then make the choice of which things to put aside is just as important as saying, well, this is the must do.
You asked me about brittleness. The capacity one really hits me hard because you'll have leaders say, well, we need everybody to be working at 100% capacity. Like how we've all heard leaders say that, right? My team's not working hard enough. They're not putting in their 8 hours a day. And the reality is, as a leader, if that's your measurement stick, you're killing resiliency and innovation. Like
Yeah.
point blank.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny because especially in environments, I've been through multiple turnarounds now and, been fortunate to be part of some very successful ones. And this idea that as we reduce the number of people working,
Mhm.
we're not reducing, if somebody thinks you're not going to reduce the work that needs to be done, you gotta recalibrate. And even in organizations that are successful, if everybody is feeling like they're at maximum capacity, right, they are emotionally frayed, they are going to look for relief, right? You can sustain that for a period of time, but it can't become the norm.
Yeah,
And
you're only successful through heroics, which is a short-term win.
yeah, yeah, I love that quote. I love that quote. So as we're looking at this, and I know we're getting close to the end of this session of our podcast, any sort of words of wisdom or sort of provocative questions that you would want to share with the people who are listening as they balance these ideas of improving efficiency, improving the effectiveness, improving the numbers, and at the same time maintaining resiliency and competitiveness over time?
Yeah. So you talked about cross-functional teams earlier, and something that I think kind of doubles down on resiliency as it relates to cross-functional teams is
Uh-huh.
also reteaming. So if you build too much subject matter expertise in with a small group of people, they can become too insulated and stop thinking about problems in a way that creates resiliency that we're talking about. So finding opportunities to move people around to different problems so that you get that diverse perspective will help with that resiliency as well. So I would strongly suggest folks think about cross-functional teams as well as reteaming those cross-functional teams at some cadence that makes sense for your organization.
Yeah. For me, that's just, stirring the soup, right? Adding a little bit new spice to it, keeping it fresh. Love that. So why don't we use that as a good place to stop our conversation for today. I want to thank everybody for listening in. Again, this is The Fault Line, CMG Consulting's podcast. Find us anywhere that you get your podcast. Check us out on LinkedIn. Check us out at the CMG Consulting website. And tell your friends about these discussions. If you find value in them, we'd love to have you be advocates. We love a good influencer out there for us. And with that, we'll wrap it up. Until next time, take care.